This story is inspired by the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. In this work, Frankl presents a powerful theory that even in the most difficult and painful circumstances of life, humans can find meaning and purpose. He emphasizes that the meaning of life is not solely dependent on external conditions, but is found within individuals and their ability to find purpose in the face of suffering and crisis. This concept forms the heart of the story, where the main character embarks on a journey to seek meaning and freedom from within, despite existential and societal challenges. While the story may also reflect similar themes of accepting suffering and searching for truth as explored by other great philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Albert Camus, the narrative specifically draws from Frankl's teachings on finding meaning in suffering and personal crisis. Let's start the story. The main character, a man named Arman, was sitting in a cold night in a small-town café. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, and the soft sound of jazz music was heard from the speakers. But he didn't see any of this. His mind was caught in another world. Arman was in a complicated and misleading situation. He always told himself that his life was full of unanswered questions. Is the real meaning of life just in pursuing goals and achievements? Or is there something beyond these? It all started when he accidentally found a book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. This book, which talked about the search for meaning amidst human suffering, had a profound impact on him. Arman, who had previously immersed himself in everyday problems, suddenly felt that his life had become meaningless. He could not ask himself whether he should live only in pursuit of personal and social desires, or whether the meaning was something beyond that, something that could not be described in simple words. During the day, Arman continued his daily lifestyle. He worked, spent time with his friends, went out, and was present in groups. But in the middle of the night, when everything calmed down, loneliness and his thoughts would overwhelm him. He had come to the conclusion that perhaps, as Frankl had said in his book, the meaning of life lies not in external circumstances, but within the human being. But the question that occupied his mind was how he could find this meaning within himself. Does it mean accepting pain and suffering? Or is it perhaps the freedom to accept the realities of life? A few days later, Arman decided to continue his search for the meaning of life. This time, not in books and other people's opinions, but within himself. He knew that this search might never lead to a definitive answer, but something in his heart told him that he should continue on this path. One evening, as the sun was setting on the horizon, Arman decided to go to the park alone. It was a place where he always found some distance from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. In the silence of the park, right next to a small lake, he sat and looked at his reflection in the water. He remembered a book he had recently read. Frankl had written in his book, "If you miss life, its meaning will be nothing but enduring suffering." But Arman interpreted this in a different way. Maybe life is not just about searching for meaning in suffering. Maybe life really depends on realizing freedom and accepting your truth in the face of suffering. At that moment, the sound of someone's footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. When he looked up, he saw a middle-aged man walking towards him in a khaki hat and an old coat. The man said with a kind smile, "This lake always reminds me of something deep, something I've been searching for my whole life." Arman looked at him and jokingly said, "How?" The man sat down quietly and looked at the lake. "I come to this lake every morning to remind myself that the truth of life is in accepting its flow, not in fighting it. Life is like this water. It's always moving and we can never stop it. Everything changes, even us." Arman looked at the man in surprise. "So what remains? If everything is changing and we can't hold on to anything, then what is the meaning of life?" The man sighed and said, "I lived with this question for a long time, but one day I realized that meaning is not in the answers, but in the questions. When you immerse yourself in these questions and accept that you can never reach all the answers, that is when you find peace." Arman thought about his words for a moment. Perhaps, as Frankl had said, humans need suffering to find meaning, but this suffering is not something that makes life meaningless. Rather, this suffering can be an opportunity to find freedom in accepting the truth. When Arman returned home, he felt strange. The sense of confusion that had previously surrounded his life no longer bothered him. Instead, a sense of peace and acceptance settled in his heart. as if he had managed to reach a corner of the truth after his inner journey. But there were still questions in his heart. One night, when he was alone at home, he looked at the television and saw a reporter talking about global crises and social problems. Thousands of people were struggling with economic, social, and environmental problems. And at the same time, Arman remembered the words of the man in the park. Life is like water. It is always moving. Are these crises also part of the flow of life? Arman suddenly realized that life is an endless flow, not just for specific individuals or in specific situations, but on a global level and for all humans. He was no longer afraid of change and crises, but rather came to the conclusion that these crises were a part of life that he had to face, not run away from. But one big question still remained in his mind. How could he find the true meaning of life in this world full of suffering and chaos? This question drew him to Nietzsche and his philosophy. He remembered one of Nietzsche's sayings, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Maybe that was it, Arman thought. In order to understand true freedom, he had to face the suffering and hardships of life, not run away from them. A few days later, he went to a group counseling session. He had never tried anything like this before. At the session, there were several other people present, each telling their own life stories. Some of them had psychological problems, others had family and social conflicts. And through it all, Arman realized that we are all in some way on the same path together, even when we feel alone. One of the people in the counseling group was a woman named Sarah. She was talking about her own inner crises when she said, "I always thought that to find happiness and meaning, I had to run away from problems. But now I understand that I have to embrace them. I have to look at the world from within myself, not always looking for things outside." Arman made this statement deeply etched in his mind. Perhaps, just like Sarah, he should embrace all this suffering and use it as an opportunity for growth and change. Perhaps true freedom lies in the ability to embrace change and problems, not run away from them. A few weeks later, Arman decided to go on a trip. This trip was not to escape from problems or to search for something specific, but to understand himself and his life more deeply. He traveled to a remote area in the mountains where there was no sign of the modern world. There, alone with nature and silence, Arman became closer and closer to himself. One day, while sitting by a river, he thought deeply about himself. He realized that in his life, he had always been looking for things that would make him feel safe and comfortable. But in reality, life never offers complete security. Nothing in this world is permanent, and no one can escape the changes of life. Arman remembered the words of the man in the park. Life is like water. It is always moving. Now he understood this more deeply. Life, with all its crises and challenges, is a free and unstoppable flow as it is. And humans, to achieve true freedom, must learn to align themselves with this flow, not resist it. After returning home, Arman felt many changes in himself. He was no longer looking for definitive answers. Instead, he now believed in accepting the moments, facing the pain and suffering, and growing through them. Life had become a flowing, freeing process for him, and he was now ready to face it differently. A few months after that trip to the mountains, Arman was sitting in the same café where he had first meditated. This time, however, the mood was different. There was no longer any sense of confusion in his heart. He looked at life, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an endless experience to be enjoyed, even if he could never find the answers to all his questions. One evening, as he sat by the window, watching the rain outside, he thought to himself that perhaps the meaning of life was never to reach a fixed destination. Perhaps this endless path was life itself. As Nietzsche had said, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Arman now understood that life, with all its suffering and hardships, was an opportunity for growth, acceptance, and transformation. He remembered the man he had spoken to in the park. Perhaps he had been right. The truth of life is in accepting its flow. And Arman understood it now. For him, it was no longer the case that he had to fear changes and challenges. He now welcomed them with open arms. Life would never be perfect and flawless, but these very imperfections and changes were part of its beauty. Arman had come to the conclusion that true freedom did not lie in running away from suffering, but in accepting it and living alongside it. This was the meaning of life that he was looking for. Finally, when night fell and the city calmed down again, Arman left the café and walked through the deserted streets of the city. These steps were not of escape, but of acceptance. He was no longer searching for something outside himself. He had reached freedom within himself, a freedom that is possible only from truly understanding life and accepting it. This story shows that in searching for the meaning of life, humans must adapt to its changes and challenges, and instead of running away from suffering, they must make it part of their path to growth and inner freedom. Arman, like many humans, came to understand that life flows within itself and must be accepted from within to be free.